issue of scale, the issue of how particular approaches to teaching and learning and the construction and the development of school cultures takes root in a number of schools under certain circumstances, but is still seeming to experience quite a lot of slow. The uptake is slow. And I've been musing about some of the reasons why that might be, what barriers there might be, or what, as I've come to think of, like sort of unconscious or semi-conscious assumptions or beliefs which might be making this kind of development or these kinds of educational reform more difficult to implement. So the starting point is the itch which people are experiencing around the world, that somehow or other there's got to be more to school than literacy, numeracy, a good Ofsted, and GCSE and A-level results and university entrance. There's got to be something more than that, seems to be what people are after. The general assumption, certainly the people I talk to now, is that knowledge, grades, college entrance are important, but they're not sufficient in terms of the desirable outcomes of education. For example, just as a very simple example, we know that bright, high-achieving students who've been spoon-fed at school and have got their 3 or 4 A's and A stars at school find themselves struggling and floundering when they get to university because that constant construction of a structure which supports and guides and informs and cajoles is no longer there, or is no longer there at anything like the same extent. And what their school teachers neglected to give them was the resilience and the resourcefulness to know how to cope when they were being less supported. Here's a quote from Alan Percy, who's the head of counselling at Oxford, who I spoke to, had a long phone call on the conversation. This is not specifically about Oxford, but the example will do. He said students, and he's seeing this more and more, students often don't seem to grasp the full meaning of learning, he said. Learning is finding out something you didn't know and struggling with it. It's almost as if they don't know something immediately, they feel as though they're failing. And that I think is not profitably seen as a sort of failure, endemic failure of character. It's more productively seen as a potential failure of pedagogy. A failure of a style of teaching which got the results, but at the cost of not developing the independence that they now need. And there's pretty broad agreement with this. Here's another quote. I agree that education should aim to produce confident, creative and critical thinkers. I agree that we should prepare pupils for the 21st century. I agree we should design our education system to suit everyone. A system in which everyone can be a winner, rather than traditionally, as it has been, predicated on creating a distinction between winners and losers at the education game. I agree that pupils should be active learners and lessons should be engaging. Daisy Christodoulou in 7 Myths of Education, which is often taken as a kind of Bible of the kind of kickback against the learning to learn, learning skills movement, and so on. Yet there seems to be little disagreement. There is some disagreement about how we get to that point, how we get to the point where students have the more than the grades and the certificates, but not much disagreement about the benefits of this. And there is, I'm fortunate enough to travel a lot to different places, there is, I think it's not too grand to say, a global hunt for what the plus is. I think of this as sort of results plus. Not neglecting results, of course, that's not the point. Not some fluffy caricature of a neoliberal, laissez-faire education, which is all about building happy, thriving, creative young people, but they can't read. Not that, obviously, nobody espouses that. But how do we get the results plus? And we'll talk about the plus in a minute. So you can look at, as you go around the world, the shift in the reformulation of national curricula. Scotland, Ireland, Australia, New Zealand rewritten their national curricula centrally around the development of certain kinds of, they go by all kinds of different names, these things, don't they? 21st century skills, soft skills, non-cognitive skills, learning dispositions, habits of mind, as people are grappling with this issue. So different languages are being developed, but it's all in the same territory. national conversations in Singapore, South Korea and Finland, icons of success in terms of the Pisa tables, but all of those countries deeply dissatisfied with the fact that they've been able to perfect the education of calculating robots rather than people who have independence of thought, ingenuity, flexible and fluid intelligence, and so on. Research funding, Project Zero at Harvard, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, Education Endowment Foundation, Angela Duckworth's Character Lab, millions of dollars of research money going into trying to explore what this is, what the plus is and how you get it. What should the plus be, in addition to getting more poorer kids to college or raising the levels of literacy, the traditional educational objectives. So these are additional objectives, not big part of my talk is additional objectives, not antithetical objectives to the traditional ones. And that's one of the things that we need to have a look at. Multinationals like Pearson, our host here today, has been experimenting with a job application procedure in some of its countries, some of its offices, which no longer allows you to indicate which university you went to, what class of degree you got, or what your A-level results were. Because they don't no longer find, and this is true of Google, it's true of Deloitte, I have a neighbour who I was checking this with the other day, they no longer find that those traditional academic qualifications predict the kind of flexible, fluid mentality that their jobs want. So there are a whole range of different reasons why people are looking for these things, and thousands of schools, some of which I've been involved with, and a lot of other people, in sort of parallel initiatives. Some of these you all know of, the expeditionary learning schools, Michael Fullan's new pedagogies for deep learning, studio learning, my own building learning power is one, and schools that do not belong to any particular group or any particular channel. These are just some of the countries where there are schools that I've worked with: Poland, Spain, Argentina, Chile, Thailand, Malaysia, Australia, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and so on. This is kind of a global thing, except in some sectors of the educational market discourse in England, it seems. The other countries of the Union are very actively engaged with this, and the Republic of Ireland. But not much of it, we haven't heard much of a squeak about this from, for example, the candidates for the leadership of the Tory party. Not much going on there. All looking for results plus, but plus what? And we start with the familiar litany of the things that are most familiar: the resilience, growth mindset, curiosity, flexibility, imagination, entrepreneurial spirit. All of these things are people trying to get a handle on what kind of, sometimes people use the word character, dispositions, attitudes, would benefit youngsters growing up in the complex time in our cultural history, our current cultural evolution. So the quest is on, and there are lots of pockets, diaspora of schools that really are making a difference, and some of it is well researched. Schools that are able to show there are ways of trying to datarize progress and development of resilience or curiosity, and so on. The Pisa Tests are in the process, my ex-colleague Bill Lucas, developing for the 2022, I think, Pisa Tests are developing metrics for looking at creativity and so on. They were already looking at collaborative problem solving. But it's too little too slow. There doesn't seem to be as much uptake as there might be for this project, this global inquiry, this global inquisitiveness. Many schools and jurisdictions are still clinging to style of teaching that often not only neglects the development of these characteristics, but in some cases develop characteristics which are indeed antithetical. It's possible to get 4 good A-levels and come out of school passive, docile, compliant, timid, dependent, and frightened of making mistakes. That's possible. It's possible as an outcome, and it's possible to come out of school smug, glib, arrogant, and combative. That's another character set, and we're seeing that on our televisions at the moment, aren't we? It's possible to come out defeated, depressed, disillusioned, and aggressive, having learned that the most important thing that you learned in school was that you're crap at learning. That happens to some people as well. So this is This is a live issue. What are those characteristics, and what can we do? Is there more that we can do in education to address these kinds of things? So why is this happening? Obviously, I think through inertia, through a lack of trust in an alternative, but also there are in some places active pushback, and that's where I'm interested in what the active pushback is, and trying to understand that better, and trying to see what's valid, what's legitimate skepticism, and where that shades into a kind of reflex intransigent cynicism about these kinds of things, and what we might be able to do about it. Whether we're being held back by some persistent underlying beliefs and assumptions which, despite people's efforts, somehow or other you're revving the accelerator, but the brakes are on, and progress is not being made. And sometimes, in some places, these kind of semi-conscious beliefs seem to be being buttressed by a kind of science, an appeal to science, which I find dubious. In many cases. I'm a cognitive scientist by training, DPhil in experimental psychology from Oxford. My other job, apart from education, is working as what I like to think of as a theoretical life scientist, writing books about non-intellectual forms of intelligence. That's my academic work, and we'll come back to that in a minute. So what are some of these? These are my speculations. People talk about the knowledge-rich curriculum at the moment as if a knowledge-poor curriculum was somehow an option. As if, if you were interested, there isn't a belief around that if you begin to express an interest in the development of thinking skills or learning dispositions, then somehow or other that's necessarily at odds with you. You must no longer care about knowledge, and I'll come back to more of that in a minute. But almost nobody espouses the idea that you can teach thinking skills in abstract. There was a phase, as we were learning about how to develop this approach to developing what I call epistemic character in school, an early stage, as in any new endeavour, where people were doing it in a way that was superficial and trivial and misguided, and I've been through that, and some of you will have been through the VAK and the mind maps and the bottles of water. You've been through that stage. It was like a start-up phase, but now we're more grown-up. There's better science, we're understanding the mind science better about what's going on here, so I don't know anybody who espouses that, what I now call the tinsel approach, just throw a little bit of stuff over the business as usual, and somehow you've done learning to learn. So knowledge, of course, knowledge obviously, knowledge, nobody is arguing against that. But neither do I hear very much conversation, as much as I would like to hear, about what knowledge. That should be highly contested. What is it? This is the question that David Perkins poses in one of his recent books called Future Wise. What is it that most people are most likely to need to know to live well in the mid-21st century? That's a vexed question. Is it trigonometry, fractions, metamorphic rocks, the Tudors, and the parts of speech? Are those the things that are right at the top of your list for the things that you think your children would need to know in order to flourish in the world? Well, for some people they may be. These are value judgments that we're making. But what about ecology, probability, coding, neuroscience, global finance, nationalism, fake news, blockchain, democracy, and we could go on, couldn't we? With other things that you might say prima facie, if you were a Martian, might have an equal, if not slightly stronger, claim on the learning capacities of young people than the difference between a conjunction and a preposition. I've heard some people express the idea that the important thing about knowledge is that it's a collection of facts and it's secure, and you have to get these into kids' minds, and that's why, interestingly, this pushback is often built around the notion of knowledge or facticity, rather than around notions of understanding and thinking, and I find that interesting. It's like, for my money, to understand is something deeper, something more interesting than knowledge. I can know in a way that is inert or piecemeal. I can indeed know tiny little gobbets, facts of information. But, as I say on this slide, which you can't read, life is not a quiz show. You know, being good at University Challenge doesn't mean you're good at working in an innovation unit at Google. It doesn't mean that you're good at a whole lot of other things. And the conception of the mind as somehow like a repository of factual knowledge, that the mind is like an encyclopedia, bears no relationship to the cognitive science that I'm aware of. The mind is a biological organ. It's composed of highly intricate, dynamic neural networks. It's not like books that sit on the shelves of a library where the knowledge just kind of sits there waiting for someone to come and access it and pull it out. And actually knowing that without knowing when and why and how is not a great deal of use. You can have inert knowledge. Dave Perkins has written, he's one of my, as I said, one of my gurus, has written very in detail and entertainingly how teaching Ohm's law to electricians is a different kind of learning from teaching Ohm's law to people who are doing GCSE physics. You learn in a different way. The knowledge is retained and structured in a different kind of way. It becomes usable for different kinds of purposes. So the knowledge that is good for passing GCSE physics is not necessarily the way that knowledge is best structured or organized for being able to design a good electronic circuit in an old house. Knowing in the real world is rarely an end in itself. It's a means to an end. So the science seems to me to be at odds with that kind of idea. There's also an idea around that somehow or other you can't, this idea of the sort of teaching children thinking skills is a nonsense because they have to have things to think about. Well, yes, obviously, but the argument sometimes seems to go that therefore you have to cram them full of facts before they can start thinking. It's as if you have to kind of get 4 lorry loads of bricks dumped on your front lawn before you can start thinking about designing the extension that you want to build on your house. And that doesn't correspond to my experience of teaching or learning in the big wide world. Thinking doesn't, it's as if somehow or other, once you had enough bricks, thinking would automatically happen. Right? That active, creative, critical problem solving would somehow sort of emerge if only you knew enough. And that certainly doesn't accord with my experience, and it doesn't accord with my understanding of the way you think about the organization of the mental dictionary, the mental lexicon. Thinking doesn't automatically emerge. Children, when they're learning, it's like when you encounter something new, your job, as Piaget told us a long time ago, is to accommodate and assimilate, not to store uninterpreted or unaddressed. That's not the way the bloody brain works. It doesn't just, it's not like a larder where you're storing stuff up against the day when it might be useful. Our whole evolutionary design is, what sense does it make to me now? Give me this bit of the jigsaw puzzle and I'll go looking to see where it fits. I won't wait until I've got all the bits of the jigsaw before I can start putting it together. So this seems to me a curious kind of way of approaching, thinking about things. And of course, teaching for purposeful thinking is going to be different from teaching for displaying knowledge for its own sake. You will engage students in a different kind of way if you see the development of knowledge as intricately interwoven with the exercise of thinking and the development of your capacity as a thinker as well. These things seem to me to make much more sense. So I began to talk about this a little while ago. Some people have argued that teaching knowledge and teaching thinking are at odds. They would have us believe that there's some kind of necessary tug of war between these sets of concepts, between knowledge and skills, between content and process, between rigor and relevance, between some kind of caricature of laissez-faire, undirected, sloppy project work and good, hard-nosed, rigorous, direct instruction, which will enable children to learn better. But I don't think the tug of war is the appropriate metaphor. I think another metaphor is the warp and weft of a weaver. These things are woven together, as you might imagine. Knowledge and skills, thinking and the development of knowledge and understanding go hand in hand. Rigor and relevance, as if once we start thinking about topics as being a good thing for topics to be somehow relevant to children's lives, or engaging to them, as if somehow or other that necessarily involves a sort of dumbing down, or like a patronizing kind of curriculum. Well, can't we have both? Can't we have relevance and rigor? Why do we have to sacrifice one to the other? Most of the good teaching that I know, the good teaching that I see, does both. It is engaging. Of course it's engaging. It's got to be engaging. If you're going to exercise your mental muscles and develop your knowledge, like going to a gym, you have to want to get on to the damn bicycle and pedal till you get hot and sweaty to get any benefit of it, don't you? You don't just sit in the gym taking notes about the history of the step up. You have to get on the thing and pedal. And that's what youngsters are doing in the classroom. If it's not engaging, if they're not motivated to get on the exercise machine and pedal hard, knowledge will not accrue, or at least not in any kind of useful manner in the brain, and their ability as thinkers will not develop. So I'm going to offer you another metaphor. This is supposed to look like the cross-section of a river. And in this metaphor, which I find more accurate and more useful, learning is going on in every classroom all the time at 3 different layers. On the superficial layer, there's the content, the subject, the factual nature of what's going on. Slightly lower down, on the surface, very visible, very easy to see, fast flowing. Here comes the tutors, now we're doing ionic and covalent bonding. Now here comes a little package of the French irregular verbs, and so on. Right? Easy to see, easy to talk about, easy to program, that kind of thing. A little bit lower down, the skills, the literacies, the forms of expertise, which equip you to access and manipulate those bodies of knowledge. Learning not just to do maths, but to think like a mathematician. Not just to know some history, but to know how to engage with the tricky question of the provenance of a document, and so on. Things that equip you to be a better thinker. Harder to see, slightly slower to develop. Skills are slower to develop than the mere comprehension of a fact. But down at the bottom of the river, where it's darker and things move more slowly, is the gradual appreciation of these attitudes or habits of mind. As we're doing whatever it is we're doing. And there are correspondingly 3 different facets of the overall skill set of the good teacher. One facet is about being a good, reliable knowledge transmitter and communicator. You need to know your stuff. You need to explain it clearly. You need to ask good diagnostic questions, good assessment for learning practice. Of course we need that. Right? We're not in either or territory here. If you're going to be developing those forms of disciplinary expertise, then the activities that you design, just like a master jeweler sets activities for her apprentices, which are at a level which gradually stretch and build their expertise, build their competence. So the kind of activities we design and the kind of feedback that we offer is critical to the development of expertise. But down at the bottom of the river, it's the culture that we create. You can't teach character. If you try and teach people's moral, there's a lot of interesting experiments on this. If you try and encourage people's moral development by having them have classroom discussions and go to seminars on moral philosophy and fill in worksheets, it doesn't make any difference to their behaviour. Someone's level of intellectual moral reasoning is no predictor of whether they've received an antisocial behaviour order or not. And interestingly, a little study some time ago that I think won the Ig Nobel Prize showed that books, when people still read books in university libraries, the books that were most stolen from the philosophy section were books on moral philosophy. That's interesting to know, isn't it? So, in my way of looking at things, we are all willy-nilly cultivators of character. I can teach history in a way that builds uncritical credulity about written text, that builds the skills of solo comprehension, that focuses you on accurate retrieval of facts, or you can do the Tudors in a way that builds empathy and collaboration and critical thinking. It's not about neglecting the content, It's about what we use the content for, how we develop it. So you can't not be a player. It's not legitimate to say, as I heard someone say, when Mick Waters' personal learning and thinking skills curriculum, England's only attempt to have a go at this territory, came out and was quickly neglected. A teacher in a secondary school looked at the personal learning and thinking skills and said with a weary and cynical air, I'm a maths teacher, I'm a damn good maths teacher, and now they're telling me I've got to teach bloody thinking as well. As if this was a new and unwelcome imposition on his professional autonomy. Of course, he always had been teaching thinking. The question is, what kind of thinking? Are you teaching fractions in a way that encourages passivity, compliance, dependency, and fear of error? Or are you teaching adding fractions in a way that encourages collaboration, critical thinking, and imagination? You can do either. It's our choice. It's our pedagogical choice in the classroom as to whilst we're doing very similar things on the surface of the river, the kinds of habits of mind that we're cultivating lower down in the river. There's another funny bit of science that gets wheeled out sometimes to sort of, as if it were a rationale for this buzz off with all your fancy stuff about 21st century skills, we just have to fill them up with knowledge, point of view. And this is this funny set of claims that you find, and I've taken as my text here again from Daisy Christodoulou's book, 7 Myths About Education, where she's talking about working memory. She's borrowed from Dan Willingham a model, interestingly, which Willingham says in his book, just about the simplest model of the mind possible. In other words, radically inaccurate. Right? This is taken as if it was somehow scientifically proven, as if this was the last word. And then this is used in the following way. This is Daisy. The more knowledge we have, the more types of problem we're able to solve. Well, okay. The reason why we need that knowledge in long-term memory is that our working memories are limited. Working memories can only hold 3 to 7 new pieces of information at once. So there's some kind of the interpretation of this here, that it's like because working memory has a limited capacity, you have to cram it all into long-term memory first. And that somehow or other relieves you of this bottleneck problem. Well, this image of the mind has been well worked over and well critiqued since it was first brought to birth in 1958 by Donald Broadbent, who was then director of the Applied Psychology Research Unit and very much influential when I was doing my undergraduate psychology at Cambridge. This idea of the limited capacity channel, the limited number of things that you can hold in mind. But things have moved on in the last 60 years or so, as you would expect them to have done. This notion of classical working memory is needed in situations where real-time integration into a meaningful comprehension is not possible. But what you're doing now is what I've just described, real-time integration. You're not storing the words as if you were being thrown balls that you're having to kind of juggle with before you can integrate them. The mind is built to integrate in real time if it possibly can. And we only need the facility of something like that short-term memory store that just keeps things being recycled under unusual circumstances, like having to remember a long string of digits. Most of what goes on in most classrooms isn't like that. Therefore, it's not clear how appropriate this model is, whether this sense of the bottleneck and using that as a justification for the crudest version of the knowledge-rich curriculum doesn't seem to hold up. Furthermore, the idea that working memory is like a store, like a little box. This is what people, when I was first doing my psychology, they love to make these little diagrams like this. Like a box and then an arrow, and then another box and then an arrow. Which one of the gurus of this area, one of the founders of cognitive psychology, a man called Ulrich Neisser, wrote a textbook on cognitive psychology in which he had lots of little diagrams with boxes linked by arrows, and in the boxes he wrote processing, more processing, still more processing, because they don't tell you anything. They don't get to a level of explanation which tells you anything interesting about what's going on. You can draw a box and call it working memory, but that doesn't tell you anything about what's happening in the brain. So it's not a store, actually. The way people are thinking more about working memory now, and I may have to do this too quickly, it's a process of the way in which the brain has learned to manage its own patterns of activation. Basically, executive function, self-regulation, working memory are about the brain having learned to keep itself attention focused, as it were, to create a bright zone. This metaphor is not entirely reliable, but we'll use it for the moment, like it's the spotlight. A bright zone of things that are lit up, which are pertinent to what you're up to at the moment. And then the brain is smart enough to create a temporary inhibitory stockade around the edge of that to stop it being interrupted by other things. That's what working memory is. It's a dynamic function of the brain as a whole. There's no separate box that things have to go through. So if you're going to have a more current, more interesting, more neuroscientifically credible model of executive functional working memory, I think your rationale for the stuff the facts into them in order to relieve the pressure begins to fade away. It's not a bottleneck, and this doesn't justify the cram the knowledge into them. Some people have argued, Dylan William argues, learning skills and attitudes are so tied to particular domains that it's silly to think about trying to teach generic skills. Well, yes, it is. The idea that you can sit people down and teach them thinking skills, there's lots of research done on that, and it doesn't work. Kids tend to enjoy it, but it doesn't transfer and it doesn't last if they're given like cute little puzzles to do. You have to embed the cultivation of resilience and curiosity and collaboration in the context of youngsters getting together to wrestle with tricky stuff. Right? That's how your thinking muscles grow. And actually that's how this vexed issue of metacognition, which the EEF is very keen on at the moment, is often presented as if it was something very mysterious, as if somehow or other there was a part of you that was able to look through the glass clock case of the workings of your own mind and see what was going on. Well, there is no glass clock case in the mind. Metacognition is the internalized dialogue about the process of thinking that you first developed in your interactions with your classmates. You have interesting conversations about something tricky in the course of trying to find a way of understanding it, and what gets said in that dialogue, this is the way Vygotsky would explain it, isn't it? What gets said in that dialogue begins to become an internal voice through which you can self-regulate your own thinking and problem-solving activities. That's all that metacognition is. So we don't need to get too aerated about that. So these things aren't so welded together. We all talk the language of reasonably disembedded traits. We talk about someone being kind, or someone else being smart, or someone else being habitually late. We use that language of personality traits all the time, and the truth is we are somewhat situation-specific, situation-embedded, and also we have dispositions and traits and tendencies too. So we could apply that, couldn't we, just as well to thinking skills or curiosities, just as much as we do to the irritating habits of our partners and our neighbours. Right? We can have a sort of a sensible middle ground, a sensible middle way. What's more, we can deliberately aim, so you don't teach generic skills, but what you can do is teach in a way that encourages the disembedding of resilience from specific contexts, so that it moves in the direction of becoming more generic. So of course it's silly to say we can sit youngsters down and teach them how to think in abstract without any thinking material. Of course we always have a job to work on, but that doesn't mean that something generic is not being built. Just as if you go out and play a lot of golf, you get better at golf, but you also get fitter. Right? There's a generic benefit. There's an aspect to the learning that is happening which is more generalized than that which is the specific concept. So, And then we get to the kind of the star thing, which is a whole lot of assumptions about intelligence. The idea that intelligence is fixed. Well, that's not the way most people are thinking about it at the moment. Lauren Resnick, the doyen of intelligence researchers in the US, wrote in 2000, way back, intelligence is the sum total of your habits of mind. We know that intelligence is much more situation specific. Move children from a class with one teacher to another teacher and their IQ seems to change. And it's paradoxical, isn't it? That whilst on the one hand, some of these knowledge-rich people are arguing that there's no such thing as generic skills, yet they're perfectly content with a generic notion of intelligence. Funny that, isn't it? Right? It depends on, you know, what suits an argument at a particular moment. It varies with the teacher, so we won't go into that. This particular hobby horse of mine is that intelligence is not the same thing as intellect. We as a society have radically shrunken the concept of intelligence so that it's become about abstract problem solving, the kinds of stuff that you do in maths, right? Or in certain kinds of exercise in school. But we know that intelligence, we now know that intelligence is powerfully involved, embroiled with emotion. Your intelligence depends on how sensitive you are to your bodily processes. Did you know that? The quality of your real life decision making depends on how accurately you can track your own heartbeat without putting your finger on your pulse. Fascinating research going on. This is the book that I wrote for Yale University Press. How grown up is that? About 4 years ago, called Intelligence in the Flesh, Why Your Mind Needs Your Body Much More Than It Thinks. So this is the other side of me coming to my aid at the moment. And also we know, I'm reading a book at the moment, some of you may have come across, called The Intelligence Trap, which is all about the particular forms of stupidity that are characteristic of very clever people. Viz. The Tory leadership debate at the moment. But such as intellectual arrogance. If you're very clever, you think you must be right, so you don't go looking for counter-arguments. You get better at rationalizing your own dumb opinions. Right? And very often, very clever people, that is to say people who've confused intelligence with intellect, very clever people see thinking as if it was some kind of combative debating. You know, as if what went on about Brexit was really the same kind of thing that you cut your teeth on in the sixth form debating society at Eton. And it isn't. It's different from that. It's more important than that. It's more embodied than that. It's more social than that. So there are all kinds of mistakes that we might make about that. And we haven't got time to do how to measure outcomes on what don't count. Another mistake that sometimes gets made is sort of like a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. So sometimes some of the writings or the rationales that some of the more extreme wing of the knowledge-rich people come up with is based on an extraordinarily limited set of reading that seems to serve their own purposes, and sometimes quite out of date. So in case there were any in the room, I put up a kind of useful beginner's reading list of things that would give a much richer and more interesting perspective, rather than relying all the time on Daniel Willingham and E.D. Hirsch. So if we were to kind of bring to the surface and submit to some kind of intelligent scrutiny some of these underlying assumptions about mind, about the nature of research, about the nature of teaching, and so on, then I think we might be able to put a good squirt of WD-40 on educational reform where it needs to exist. There might be fewer of these unconscious blockers behind, and we might go looking for that which works rather than having a more entrenched and in some cases cynical reaction to what you're talking about. This is the commercial. So if you do, as I've spent a lot of my life, trying to surface and interrogate those beliefs, and then find yourself in a position where you're not saying, can we teach character and physics at the same time, but how shall we do it? Then all kinds of things come to light. As Goethe said, whatever you do, believe you can, begin it. Genius has boldness, power, and magic in it, he went on to say. So we're doing a series of books at the moment, which are in the Crown House store, which are digests of research and practice from all around the world behind this school of thought. The school of thought which says, not either or, thank you, both and, please. Let's have both the rigour and the relevance. Let's have both the content and the process. Let's have a more